Those of you that know me have probably heard the story of how we met Mike and Marnie many years ago, but I want to start with a word or two about it because I think it's so indicative of something important about Mike's character. Marilyn and I met Mike, Marnie, and Kate on the evening of July 23rd, 1968, nearly 45 years ago, on a street corner in Chelsea when I asked him directions to the Duke of Wellington pub. And his characteristic generosity of heart and spirit became crystal clear to us even in the first moments of what became a long, happy, and rewarding friendship. Even, in fact, before we learned his name or those of the rest of the family. Kate at that time was just 3 months old and Alexander hadn't yet entered the scene. Not only did Mike kindly supply the needed information, but he also chased after us up the street when he realized we might not find it without his help, and we could possibly lose the way. The 5 of us, or 4 and a half of us considering Kate's tender age, ended up spending the evening together talking, although if I recall correctly, Kate didn't have much to say at that initial meeting, and Marnie and Mike then invited us back to their flat for coffee with a further invitation to join them for dinner the following evening. So much for the myth of the aloof Londoner, we thought. All of this made a great impression on us, and it strongly contradicted the stereotype view of the standoffish Britisher. And that tired cliché certainly didn't apply to Mike. His openness and generosity extended to us in all directions. He was willing, for example, to forgive us for being Americans and for not yet having seen the obvious virtue of being dyed-in-the-wool socialists. And he was even willing to make allowance for my occasional habit of reading the London Times, a paper of which he thoroughly disapproved. His kindness even extended so far as to allow me to beat him at bar billiards on occasion. The only place he drew the line was when I drove him in an automobile using only one of my hands on the steering wheel. Although he was an undriving Londoner, his keen interest in Grand Prix racing, which he followed avidly on television and in the newspapers, allowed him to make many helpful driving suggestions, some, of course, more helpful than others. When Marnie would drive him on outings, she once told me, he loved to sit in the back seat with a good beer guide and an AA map in his lap and suggest appealing alternate routes for her and the 2 children. But best of all, his generosity extended to giving us repeated invitations and royal welcomes during our many visits to him, as he and Marnie and Kate and Alexander moved from London to Oxford to Whitney. We became regular residents at 83 Warwick Street and in Langle House, and we were always greeted with Mike's customary warmth and enthusiasm. Through Mike, we also made the acquaintance of many of his friends, some of whom came in turn to America to visit us, as did Mike and Marnie. And Kate and Chris later came over for a visit and decided to get married while they were our guests. All this pleasure, mind you, stemmed directly from Mike's original friendliness on our first meeting. Mike was a wonderful talker, and his favorite topic was politics, on which he held very firm views. Those who disagreed with him he treated like stubborn students, in other words, as poor misguided creatures needing his further direction and wisdom in order for them to eventually see the light he could provide. And in his politics, he would brook little compromise. I well remember his dismay, for example, when the Laborites were debating their plan to drop Clause 4. He would have none of it. His favorite pastime on the many vacations and trips we shared together involved finding a sunny spot in which to sit and sketch, and he would do it for hours on end with his beloved and tattered straw hat on his head. Although Marnie eventually prevailed on him to purchase a shiny new one, it was clear he could never quite develop as much affection for it as for the original, and I'm sure it's still hanging on a hook somewhere in his studio. And in his art, too, his generosity clearly showed itself, because the only thing he loved more than doing his pen and ink and watercolor drawings was giving them away to friends, and we have many of them hanging on our walls at home to remind us of him and our wonderful times together, and I suspect many of you here today have them as well. Mike was, of course, an architect by trade, and in the application of that practice there appeared a tiny fragment of his character which did not reflect his open and generous spirit. That revealed itself in the width of the doors he designed for his domestic projects. He was definitely a minimalist in that department, and more than once Marnie had to remind him that the point of a door was not just to provide an opening for a person to squeeze through like a mouse through a hole, and that he could consider it politically correct to design a doorway you could walk through without turning sideways. For me, one of Mike's most enduring qualities was his great sense of humor, and he especially loved to tease me about things British. On one occasion, when we were touring a stately home, the lights briefly flickered, and Mike gravely explained to me that it was just the Duke dropping another shilling in the meter. Looking back over these many years, we best remember Mike for his hospitality, his kindness, his enthusiasm, his love of conversation and companionship, his warmth, his art, and for all the other myriad of ways he and Marnie and Kate and Alexander and their families enriched our lives with their friendship and making us godparents in the process. And we shall never forget him.